Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English, and we now turn to what some consider a very controversial topic. I think that it is one that we have to give due diligence to, proper respect to. Let's write it in our notes as simply the question of the role of religion, and more particularly Christianity, in what we will refer to as the slavery epoch or the slavery experience. Now, I'm with you in your hymnals on 530, 531 and following. It is difficult to know for an anthology maker how to treat this topic. We know that religion and Christianity played a powerful role within this time period that we will call the slavery epoch. We know that. The challenge is to talk about the multiplicity of ways religion was used. Now, elsewhere, I have given a series of lectures on the 1611 King James Version of the Bible and the role of religion and other different types of understandings of history. I want to turn now and talk specifically about this time in American thought, in American history. There's any number of ways to start to speak of this. One way to talk about this, a whole experience, is to ask the simple question, was religion and Christianity on the side of the slave holder or the slave? I would write that question down at level 1. It is an important question. If you've already read and studied Frederick Douglass's passage that we worked with in another session, you will recall that he makes the observation halfway through that passage that his mother master was a real Christian until she wasn't. What did he mean by that? And what role does Christianity, and religion in particular Christianity, have to play in this experience of slaves and slave holders? A number of years ago, some postcards were discovered that became part of an exhibit, I think first at the Smithsonian, that showed there was a certain time in American history, for a very brief time, when Americans of the Deep South were sending letters to one another and to people in the North, writing on the back of postcards. On the front of those postcards were photographs. These photographs were of lynchings of black people in the Deep South. Charred bodies that had been burned after they had been hanged on a tree, with people standing around the charred bodies in their Sunday finest taking photographs as if it was a celebration of a kind. One of the most unsettling elements of these photographs, which became the subject of huge controversy, was how many of the people in the photographs, two things, how many of them were children, very young children, seeing this kind of spectacle. And secondly, how many of them were holding Bibles? What? Yes, Bibles. They were holding the religious text of Christianity and standing next to, celebrating the lynching of a black person. Horrific. But it raises again the question, religion and particularly Christianity was on which side of this discussion of slave versus slaveholder? Let's go ahead now and get it out of the way quickly. Both sides claimed that religion was on their side, that Christianity in particular was on their side. Both sides did. Now, for those of us today who look at the whole issue of slavery as being an abomination, and I would hope that's all of us, obviously the question is, how in heaven's name did people who owned slaves believe in any way that religion and Christianity in particular could validate what it was they were doing? There are references within the Bible itself to the legitimation of slavery, if not the legitimation, at least no direct condemnation in some of these passages, that seem to suggest that there are some people who are born to be slaves. That is a very Aristotelian understanding. Some men are born, some women are born to be slaves, and that's just the way that it is. It is that organic or natural view that says there's just some people that are born to be slaves and they should just get right with it. Interestingly, religion and Christianity played a role in the lives of slaves as well. Now, the Bible is a story that tells of the emancipation, the freeing of slaves in a famous book called Exodus. This is the story of a famous leader named Moses, who leads what will be referred to in the Bible as the children of Israel, namely Jews, out of their bondage in slavery in Egypt. Slaves identified with this story of slaves of another time finding their freedom. Slaves as well would use the songs of Christianity as a way to express their great pain and their longing for emancipation and freedom. Whether that be freedom from slavery and or the freedom of death and then a journey to heaven where no longer they had to be slaves. All over the Deep South, slaves identified with the congregations that many of them attended, either formally or informally. Slaveholders were made very uncomfortable by often these gatherings, because when you put a large number of slaves together, it was always concerning. Maybe there was plotting to try to overthrow slave masters and the like. The history of Christianity in relationship to the emancipation of slaves, President Lincoln was a devoutly religious man, and the quest towards civil rights. We don't just call him Martin Luther King Jr., we call him the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. He was trained as a minister in Christianity. And in his famous I Have a Dream speech, we'll quote directly from the Bible. Now I want to turn really quickly to page 530. And under literary analysis, we have this word that we want to write down at to be. Remember, to be our rhetorical understandings, our literary analysis understandings. And this word is illusion. Now, if you go and watch a magician do his or her job, that is an illusion, I-L-L-U-S-I-O-N. In other words, whoa, the elephant is there, and then 1 minute, and then the next minute, gone. That's an illusion, I-L-L. The word you've written down on your notes is illusion, A-L-L-U-S-I-O-N, illusion. Now, what exactly is this word, an illusion? Let's get it in our notes, to be. An illusion is a reference to another text. A reference to another text. We will find in both of these readings, now that we're to turn to these spirituals, what before was often referred to as slave spirituals or Negro spirituals or African American spirituals. Your textbook will use terms that are a little bit more politically correct today and simply refer to them as spirituals of the Deep South, especially the slavery epoch. We're going to look at two of these. The first is called Go Down Moses, and the second is Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Now, ostensibly, let's just put it in your notes, these are poems. These are poems. Lyrics of a song that will be sung or sometimes chanted. I'm with you on page 533, background information. Let's go ahead and look at this information before we then listen to a rendition of this famous spiritual. Africans were first brought to this country as slaves, and I'd write this date down, 1619. That is a significant date. You'll notice we often pay attention to these dates. 1619. Tom Jefferson will write his famous words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," in 1776. So look at your date you wrote down. Notice it. 1619. At 1719. Already 100 years of slavery in America. At 1819. 200 years of slavery. Do you understand? In other words, the experience of slavery, slave owners, slaves working in any number of different types of situations on plantations and elsewhere, is an institution of over 200 years. For example, in 1863, when Abraham Lincoln will give his famous Gettysburg Address. In other words, slavery is a long-held institution. Although the slave trade, I'm back with you reading on 533, although the slave trade was banned in 1808, slavery itself remained legal. In the years before the Civil War, many enslaved Africans fled captivity. They were hidden and transported by the Underground Railroad. I would write that term down. Underground Railroad. Now, sometimes my juniors assume that this was the first subway system in America. No, we simply call it underground because it is subterfuge. In other words, it is not known publicly. It is something that was illegal. To help and emancipate a slave was an illegal act. It could end you up in jail or worse. You weren't allowed to help free a slave. Why? The slave belonged to his or her owner as property. It would be just like you walking up to somebody's car and stealing it to help free a slave. They called it the Underground Railroad. Keep reading with me. Notice, a secret network of activists dedicated to helping fugitives reach freedom in the North and in Canada. One of these activists, very important name, we want to write her name down, is Harriet Tubman. You can see the photograph of Harriet Tubman on 533, who was born a slave around 1820. Tubman's remarkable efforts earned her the name Moses. Whoa, so Harriet Tubman equals Moses. This is a term that's often used for her. Again, who is Moses? Think of him as the liberator. He is the individual who will lead slaves out of Egypt. As your book says, Moses led the Israelites out of captivity in Egypt. Tubman escaped slavery via the Underground Railroad and then risked her life to return for her family. She returned to the South repeatedly to rescue other enslaved Africans, eventually leading more than 300 people to freedom. Whoa! So I would write this down. Here is a woman, here is an American, here is a person who needs to be celebrated for her courage and her actions. Working through the Underground Railroad system, 300 people to freedom. Now, of course, the skeptic or the cynic will point out, that's 300 people saved. But what about the tens of thousands of people who live and die in slavery during these hundreds of years that were not saved? This is, of course, a tragedy and a black mark in American history. There's no one that would want to debate that part of the equation. We're now going to turn to this spiritual, Go Down Moses. I think it probably makes sense that right away you recognize that if Tubman is understood as a Moses figure, and she is in the North where slaves can be freed or emancipated to North and Canada, and she then goes down south to try to free some of these, that it would make some sense why the title of our song is Go Down Moses. Of course, again, the allusion here, the reference here, is to the great liberator in the Bible, Moses himself, who went to the king of Egypt. He was called a Pharaoh, and walked up to this Pharaoh and said, "You must let my people go." Moses in the text is raised as an Egyptian, only to discover in his adult life that actually his parentage, his lineage is Jewish. He is not Egyptian at all, he's rather Hebrew. And once he realizes that he's Hebrew, Jewish, he has to help lead all of the rest of his brethren and out of Egypt and therefore goes to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." In the story, Pharaoh says no. And of course, then visited upon Pharaoh and Egypt the famous 10 plagues that you maybe have heard about, terrible things happening to the Egyptians because they refused to allow the Israelites to leave. Of course, the end of that story, for those of you that miss Sunday school, is that finally Pharaoh allows for these Israelites to leave. Moses leads them out into the desert where they are chased by Pharaoh and his troops. They come to a large body of water. The water is separated, allowing the children of Israel to walk through. The story says on dry land. And then once they are freed, the Pharaoh and his troops try to follow, and the waters then descend upon all of the Egyptian troops, and they all die drowning. Okay? This is the story from the book of Exodus in the Judeo-Christian Bible. Here we're going to hear all kinds of references to this notion of freedom. We'll listen to an actual singing of this lyric, of this song. I'm with you now on page 533. Let's go ahead now and just work with the text itself and then exegete.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh to let my people go. When Israel was in Egypt land, let my people go. Oppressed so hard they could not stand, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Thus saith the Lord, old Moses said, let my people go. If not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go.
Now let's go ahead and make some quick annotative notes. Who would slaves singing this, chanting this song, who would they identify Pharaoh as? Go ahead and jot down an idea or two of who you think it would be. Who would slaves singing this song identify Pharaoh as? Old Pharaoh who is told, let my people go. Who would that be, the Pharaoh? Obviously, the slaveholder is the one that comes immediately to mind, yes? The Moses, then, figure here, notice, is going to be a tribute directly to Tubman. We've already mentioned Harriet Tubman and this notion of her importance in the Underground Railroad, right? Later, this will be identified often as Abraham Lincoln himself, who will be the signer of the Emancipation Proclamation. To emancipate means to free. There is an understanding that these slaves who were identifying with this song would be told in their own Bibles in the book of Exodus that it had been hundreds of years that the children of Israel were in captivity and bondage as slaves. So there was a reason for a number of these slaves reading the Bible to hold out hope that maybe someday there would be finally freedom and they would not have to live in slavery anymore. Let's now turn to the second of our spirituals. This one, Swing Low, Sweet chariot. Now, the reference here is to a different Christian biblical text. So at 3a, obviously, we want to write this one down. If at 3a you've already written down Exodus as the great story of freedom, here you want to write down the great old prophet Elijah. Elijah, who when he was old, the Bible story goes, was taken or transported to heaven in a fiery chariot. A chariot, a wheeled instrument behind a horse being pulled by a horse. Okay. Now, this spiritual is built around a refrain. That is to say, notice it's said over and over again. This one is coming to carry me home. Now, let's make sure before we listen to this one that you understand there's kind of two renderings of this coming home, to carry me home. The first, obviously, is the desire for eternal salvation, the true spiritual freedom in heaven, as Christianity will teach it. Right. Of course, the second is a longing for emancipation from slavery. The sweet chariot, the band of angels, as we'll read about it here and listen to it here in a moment, both of them, of course, symbols for the Underground Railroad as well. Okay. Let's go ahead now and turn to this one, and then we'll make some finishing comments about both of these spirituals in our annotative process. Swing low, sweet chariot.
Swing low, sweet chariot, a spiritual. Swing